I've been doing both contracting and consulting since 1993, my life's the whole life's been rather ironic in a sense, I think. After Parks Victoria gets, I'll highlight this, they manage over 16% of the state and get $16 per hectare. While here in Metro Melbourne and in development processes, we do, and in bushland management, we deal with very small bits of native veg and with land that gets a lot of attention and a lot of money spent on it, ironically, a lot more than huge bits of the states with a lot more conservation values. Having said that, the other irony that I want to highlight too is that when we deal with urban bushland management and native veg in development, most of the people I negotiate with have no idea about ecology. They couldn't even hardly recognize a native grass, and they're the decision makers. So it's sometimes hard enough to get them to recognize that there's something valuable there to manage, much less how you actually manage it or measure that management. So when I was thinking, one of my themes was going to be, well, why don't, actually here's my outline, so let me, first I'll say, why don't people monitor very well, or why don't they monitor at all? Then why should we do it? We've heard a bit about that. And I've got 3 little case studies about how I've tried to use management over time with my clients who weren't ecologists or very good land managers sometimes. And I want to introduce the national standards for ecological restoration, and there is a link to monitoring in this document. So now, when I was thinking about why don't people monitor very well, one of the reasons is they don't actually know how. And just this week, just as an example, I got a tender to respond to managing a few hectares of riparian land. It had a centimeter of paperwork in it, and a bunch of people had looked at it, written up a bunch. And yet when I looked at the end of it, when I looked through it, I still didn't know. And one of the things I want to know about this site was, well, what's the current cover of weeds? How much numbers how many plants are we going to put in? How much weed control is going to occur over 3 years? Then what is the desired condition at the end of 3 years? And the only numbers that we had in this, the only numbers they had in the plan was a list of weeds to get from 20% cover to 1%, no idea how much of the site that was, and survival of of 2,000 plants per hectare. And identify it because basically we were a contracting company at the tail end of it, getting the contract work, trying to get the contract work, but everybody involved all the way along had little idea of ecology or even the people who did, and I will apologize to the consultants in the room who do a better job, but too often, even the ecologists who write the management plans in a lot of the consultancies I find aren't very practical management plans. It's sometimes they leave a bit to be desired in practicality and clarity about what the management process should be. So that's to me, that's one of the reasons we don't do monitoring very well, is that a lot of that too much of the ecological restoration and management work that occurs is actually the decision makers know little about ecology, much less about monitoring and measuring that. Now, of course, what's more important, also, there's a few reasons, in my view, why monitoring doesn't work, why monitoring for clear biodiversity outcomes. Because, of course, what you want to monitor for is a clear goal, hopefully. Sometimes you don't get that. Sometimes we're just told to manage and not have that, and not actually determine objectives very well. But what I find is a lot of the land managers I deal with, or developers, if it's a development project, have no scientific training. So talking about monitoring is sometimes difficult because you're starting on a low base. And the one I forgot to throw in here was, I was reminded at a meeting I was having with a land manager last night, is they said, oh, we want to do the work, we don't want to monitor it. We don't want to get the work done. But then if you're not sure how effective your work is, should you be doing it? So now the second point up here about the land managers haven't been convinced there are efficient ways to monitor ecological condition and outcomes. What I find is, over time, there has been efforts to monitor, but often the balance between efficiency and effectiveness hasn't been reached. And so there's been monitoring. I've seen councils and take up monitoring frameworks and then find that too many resources were taken up in implementing them, or too many, or they weren't practical, and then they were abandoned because they hadn't been designed that well in the first place. But sometimes they weren't picked back up. This third point about ecological management too is, too often in urban bushland management, we're embedded in open space management. And in open space management, you have horticulturalists and mowers making decisions quite often. They kind of go through the management. So it's, again, we're talking, we don't sometimes in urban bushland management get an appreciation that that conservation reserves are different to open space in general. Also, the fourth point here about, I don't think people like myself and my colleagues and academics have developed or marketed good monitoring procedures. We can talk about, over the years, we've talked about monitoring, it's important and so on, but unfortunately, sometimes we don't work hard enough to get good monitoring procedures that are effective but don't take too many resources. And my last point, and this goes with my first case study of Whitehorse, is that sometimes in bushland management, if you have a skilled crew of people in a council doing the work and getting pretty obvious improvements in bushland, in bushland reserves, weeds are declining, flora is getting more abundant, even if it's not measured in numbers or quantification, that often the people in the local community who do care, the friends of groups and so on, they're not that concerned about a good monitoring procedure. They monitor informally and they're happy with how the council's doing the work. And that's what I had. I had one client tell me for years, we don't need a monitoring procedures, the community's happy. I'm like, well, maybe. So now why should we do it? We've heard a bit about that. Account for money and time spent. My second point here is we monitor a lot of hours, and the point I keep trying to push with my clients is you can monitor time spent and plants in the ground, but that's, I think I'm borrowing this from Darcy, that's tree guard dreaming. Just because you put plants in the ground doesn't mean you've created effective habitat. And so we need to measure bigger things than small spaces. Now that's the hard bit to some degree, about how we measure bigger, are we improving the habitat across a municipality or across a city or across a state with all the bits and pieces of work we do? And those are hard questions. Now, a lot of the monitoring I do and coordinate for my clients, this is fourth point up there, is it's important to look beyond plant cover, and each reserve can be important. Too often monitoring, and it's quite properly focused just on the reserve, just where you're doing the work, because we also live in silos, is that this land manager manages over here, this land manager manages here, and you don't cooperate very much or look over your boundaries very much. But sometimes, well, in the end we need to, or every day we need to look a bit bigger than our reserve and the Melbourne Water Reserve and other people's reserve. And of course, the biggest point, monitoring should drive adaptive management rather than educated guesswork. Because an awful lot of bushland management I see is very good educated guesswork, but it's not driven, it's not seen as a cycle, as a system of management and so on, driven by monitoring data to the best degree possible. So I also borrow this. This is from a reference called Elzinga et al. From the United States, just to put monitoring in perspective. This end is, of course, where most bushland monitoring goes. ARI does a bit more on the research end, of course. And so monitoring can be quite simple and unscientific, but indicative of success or otherwise of your options. So I keep this in mind all the time, since I found it in a book, a good monitoring book 15 years ago, to say, yeah, I'm not a scientist, I'm not that good at that end of the spectrum, but I concentrate on this end. But I do try to have monitoring frameworks that can contribute to the science end. So let me get into some case studies. We developed, Whitehorse is one of the clients I had to convince over time, you should really be accountable. Measure how you're improving things. Don't just rely on faith that yes, people are looking at what you do and being happy. Don't take this too seriously. What we tried to work out, the text, this is the text from our first effort in 2008, in which we actually developed this framework. And we said, okay, one of the things we did was, how many reserves do you have? And how often do you want to review progress in them and review data? And so we actually went through a cycle and looked at the number of reserves, looked at how many years between formal monitoring reports were optimal, and then tried to figure out if the resources they felt they could put towards it would work. And that's how we came up with this cycle of monitoring, is every 3 years, a group of bushland reserves gets data monitoring is done and reports are done to report on a few years of work. And then by the end of 10 years, every bushland reserve in Whitehorse gets a report, at least one report reviewing progress of works. Because this is a big fear of, as I've identified, is we had to address the fear, oh, you want us to monitor, but we don't know how much it's going to cost or how much time it's going to take, and so on. So we thought through the time, we designed the time into the process. Now, this is 10 years of work. This is a summary of some of the monitoring of the techniques that we put into place. And we chose them for different purposes. So first of all, the bird census. This is the bird census is the 2 hectare, the 20-minute approach used for the bird atlas. Some of you will know it, I'm sure. It's a very robust data system or monitoring method, because it went through an awful lot of process in the 80s to be selected for the bird atlas. So and the bird atlas is, of course, still going with millions of these 20-minute censuses in them. So we chose that one because it was selected and thought through very well by a whole bunch of other more competent people than us. But also, it can be used on a national basis, is that this data, which Whitehorse is using in one reserve, can actually be used all the way up the ladder and stored on the Bird Atlas database and be used for any range of research projects up to a national level. So that's why we selected it. Now, Quadrats we do with the brown blanket method, trying to take into account subjectivity, as Chris highlighted, is that using the categories, the Quadrats are fairly reliable. It is for a small sample area, so it's where maybe in a reserve we want to get the best quality and we want to see some change over time in a small part of a reserve. Again, this is a data set. We can store that Quadrat data with the VBA, the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, and council doesn't have to store it. And then other people can use it. So that's one reason. That's how we've thought through some of the ways of using it. Now, habitat hectares, I've been skeptical over time of using it as a monitoring method. Mr. Lorimer Graham wrote some great papers about this, why it's not very useful a few years ago. But I still find it useful because there are the individual parameters internal to the system that can be used, weed cover and so on. You can kind of look deeper in the habitat hectares. And essentially you're forced into it as well because one of the sustainability department's goals was to measure how many habitat hectares of different EVCs were in the municipality. So we kind of had to do it, but it is useful. And it's most useful when you're actually have a very disturbed place and you're working towards you're working to change it dramatically. Then it really is effective in seeing very specific changes. And it works visually. I've got an example later. Now, we also revisit the flora species list every 10 years in a reserve, and that's the mechanism also for looking at threatened species, or if there's new weeds, redo the flora survey, re-inspect where the threatened flora species are, and so update that list and see if there's any changes over time. Now, the next method, we do the vegetation quality mapping. I'll get back to this later. I'm skeptical as Chris is. Chris exposed it, and this was a method devised by bush regenerators in New South Wales, of course, in the 80s, and we kind of stopped using it for a while. But I've got some examples of where it's turned out to be a fairly good method in the long term, where you don't do it every year, you do it every 10 years, and you can see big changes. Now, I just left this bit on the end because this is an excerpt from a matrix in which we kept track of the actions in different reserves. This is from a table where there's 30 reserves down below. And Whitehorse had a system of developing vegetation action plans every 3 years for every reserve. And fairly short, just a few pages, but I bring that in because they did need a system. You do monitor, but if you don't monitor and manage within a system appropriate to your organization, then the monitoring has nowhere to fit. So you need to always go back to the system. How do we develop our management actions? Here's a sample of habitat scoring that was really effective. This is the Flying Fox Roost site in Yarra Bend, and they spent $1 million over 5 years on it. As I say, if you spend $1 million in restoration work over 15 hectares, you better see some difference. But fortunately, we did. And even just used 4 different methods, but in this case, we used, we found that there was 10 to 15 points of increase in the habitat scoring over time. So it really did please the Department of Environment at the time, since they just spent $1 million in restoring it. Could it have been spent better? We don't quite know that from this data, but we know we did improve it. I'll go back to Whitehorse briefly. Actually, I'm running out of time. I'll skip this one, or let me tell this story briefly. This is Blackburn Lake Sanctuary. We had an adaptive management process in this reserve when it came to bushfire. They had some very nasty bushfires down here in the late 90s. They got a bushfire expert to address risk, and they said, in the early 2000s, they started a process of kind of across the whole reserve burning. But within a few years, and trying to reduce the fuel load across the whole reserve, what we knew and what they figured out was, if you can burn every few years to keep the fuel load down to a certain level, but you then eliminate a bunch of species because you've burnt too often, and you won't maintain fuel loads low with the optimal ecological fire regime. So what they adapted to over time, it took a few years, but basically now what Whitehorse does is it's a southeast corner that is burnt more often and is in effect a sacrifice zone. It tends to be burnt and fuel reduced to keep the fuel loads really low, and then the rest of the reserve rest of the bushland is burnt on much longer intervals. And it took about 5 years to work through. No, the resources aren't available and it's not appropriate ecologically. So it's a bit of adaptive management about fire risk. What we also found out in this process, we used bird censuses when we were actually converting this corner to a fuel-reduced zone. We actually took 30 truckloads out of cut and painted berseria and understory shrubs to get it to an open forest. 30 tip truck loads in 2008. But we converted it to, in effect, an open forest. And what we found through Quadrats and bird censuses was that we actually increased some species in the understory, and the birds didn't change too much, at least over a few years. So that's how we use monitoring data. Now, this case study is from Laverton. I wrote a conservation management plan. We've seen the circle. This is a very simple circle. We monitor actions, review data information, establish and adapt management priorities, management action. And this was in a management plan required by the Commonwealth in 2007, which I wrote. I then converted, we then worked out a system with our developer client. Now, this is part of the irony is, I always negotiated this with a development manager. He knew about nothing. Actually, every second year we get a new one as well. So that makes it even more difficult. But we did establish a cycle in which we would start the work, we'll do the work in July. This is all about the financial year, see there? It's not ecology, it's finance. We start our work, we basically do weed control work from July to January or February with some monitoring data in the middle. We submit a report every March to the Commonwealth with monitoring data, et cetera. If a prescribed burn is deemed essential, we get that in, and then in June we finalize works with our client, the budget and the process for the next year. All through that process, there is some basic maintenance going on, of course, too, but there is a break in the summer where we don't do much work on the site because it's the summer drafts in place. So this is the first words. This is, Ian Lunt wrote an article in 2003 about using indicator species in grassland. And I was inspired by that, I thought, because I'd been skeptical that every management plan I'd seen for grassland identified biomass reduction as important, but simply had a time thing. And we were going through the Millennium Drought, and I'm thinking, no, that doesn't work. This client saved money because biomass wasn't increasing through the Millennium Drought. You didn't need to burn to keep it up, to keep intertussock space present. So they saved money. They didn't have to burn. But once it started raining again in 2010, it certainly did. You'll see, I basically said I didn't want it to be time-based, the requirement for biomass reduction in management plan. I want it to be intertussock space-based. So, and that worked well. So here's where we take our data. So we got those points. These blue things are where we measure biomass. There's other monitoring that goes on there, but I'll push through this. So what happened was in 2014, the data said, ooh, every place is under 30% intertussock space. It is closing up. And I went to the developer and said to the development manager saying, we need a fire. The first phone call was, we can't afford it. Then I said, go back to your manager, look at the data. Because we gave the data to the Commonwealth, remember? They might give you a hard time. He brings me back a few days later and says, yes, you can do your fire. Or our fire is what he should have said, but he said your fire. So this is us doing the fire. And I also like this photo because it's what a fire should be is, if you do controlled burns, you should be bored. That's what I say to my staff. You don't want an exciting fire, you want a boring fire. Now, here's an example of the vegetation quality assessment. Not very useful scientifically, but it works really well graphically. 92, we got Gidja Walker to do this in 92 and had the opportunity to redo it 18 years later. And you can see, yeah, it's a bit subjective and so on, but the red, the worst quality zone, which is the understory cover, is much less. And we actually were able to digitize this, and we have numbers, which unfortunately you can't see very well, but the green, the greater than 75% indigenous cover has gone from 33 hectares to 15. And it's probably not exact, But this did make the Frankston City Council fairly appreciative that they'd spent millions of dollars in the foreshore over 20 years. And this bit of data helped. So let me go into the standards because I'm pushing time. Hopefully that's a bit of insight. I'll summarize what I do. I try to monitor, I'm always one, I want to be accountable, but I also want to measure improvements when we work in the urban bushland and for our clients. And you often have to push this issue, but it is important to do it. And sometimes you have to do it with people who don't understand ecology and not threaten them, but be emphatic about the importance of it. The other thing I want to do, and this is about monitoring too, this is the national standards for ecological restoration, developed by all these people, a bunch of people associated with these organizations. Why is this important? Well, I'll tell the story about it first, briefly. Is T.N. McDonald and a bunch of other people T.N. McDonald did a lot of the work. It was actually out in early 2016, and the International Society for Ecological Restoration thought it was an important thing, thought it was so important that to have one internationally that they actually had T.N. and an American essentially take out all the references to Australia, and by the end of 2017, it became an international standard of ecological restoration. Now, why is that important? Is the CEO of Society for SER International went to an IUCN meeting in December and said, you know that 40 million hectares of restoration work that you're saying should occur around the world in the next 10 years? It should be according to good standards. Because what was identified in an official report last year was there was all this restoration work being done around the world, but not actually. They were calling it ecological restoration, and it was more often plantations, particularly in China and other places. People were planting lots of trees, but not local ones, and so on. So she then got IUCN to agree to a document like this, that this would guide restoration across 40 million hectares around the world. Now, why do we need it in Australia? Because people are really confused, aren't we? You know, what's re-veg? Now there's this introduction, the purpose of ecological restoration. It explains its relationship with other forms of environmental repair. That we confuse tree planting, horticulture, landscaping. Drive down a Vic Roads freeway, you'll see, is it landscaping or is it indigenous? The people who designed it didn't quite know. So this is why it should be important in my view. Here's all the principles that go with it. I won't go into much. I'll encourage you all to read it, but it starts with one of the key things is reference ecosystems, looking at the site, how resilient it is already, how degraded it is to begin with, clear targets and goals. Now that's about monitoring. That's where monitoring comes in. I told you I'd get back here, and that the monitoring, if you don't know where you are, what conditions you have, you can't decide where you want to go, and then if you don't monitor, you can't actually make decisions about that. So, I'll stay there and let you read on about other bits. The last thing I want to say about it is, you know, again, why are these important? Is restoration is big business, but it's often quite confusing. We're confused between horticulture, tree planting restoration, and hopefully some national standards will help us clarify it. And the other reason is I worked on designing the revegetation for the desal plant. I kept being asked about standards by construction people. I said, I have a little international, this was 4 years ago. Well, now we have a standard. If you do agricultural work, basically most industries are driven by agreed standards today. Now we have one. And these standards also represent the culmination of many years of thinking, action, reflection, and experience, and can be seen as best practice. So My last point about them will be who should, in a sense, us people like myself and other contractors and people who design, who manage land, they were already knowing what to do and using the principles in the standards. They came together to create them. But actually, what I want to see is I want government institutions that make decisions about infrastructure, land management, and development to adopt them. Because it doesn't matter that much if I follow them, but it will matter if Vic Roads or the planning departments of councils follow them. That sometimes we should design that projects should be designed according to good ecological restoration standards, not some confusing blend of landscaping, horticulture, and tree planting. So I think I've gone over time probably and said too much. So I'll close there.